Great. I'm using the term purposely, of course. Make America great again. Make America great. This, of course, was the theme that permeated Wilson's push for American entry into World War I. And you saw multiple themes here infused throughout this particular segment of our six-part series. My name is Phillip Martin. I'm senior investigative reporter for WGBH in Boston, and I'm joined here by Amanda Pollak, who's the series producer for The Great War. We also have here Chad Williams, the associate professor and chair of the Department of African and Afro-American Studies at Brandeis University, also featured in the documentary, and Chris Capozzola, associate professor of history at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Just returning for a second to this notion of slogans and narrative. I was impressed by two or three things. One is the use of slogans that can basically stir a nation and can at least get part of that nation riled up and focused on an effort where heretofore they were not focused on. The majority of people in the United States at that time were against the war. Within a short time, they were for the war. And a lot of factors come into play. Loyalty. Are you loyal? Are you a real American? Are you the genuine article? This is one of the themes that came out. And then the whole notion of how do you form a great nation? And you do it, of course, in part through your people. And who are your people? They are a number of different types of people, correct, who have a number of different and varied interests in the country, and they're treated very differently. We saw the contradictions of the way African Americans are treated. We saw suffragists trying to say something quite simply, which is that women should have equal rights and a stake in our society. We saw a variety of individuals whose place they're still trying to map out in this narrative, this great narrative at the time. Amanda, you have created an extraordinary series on American experience. And I'm going to throw out the first question, if you will, and then we're going to turn to questions that come to you from the audience. And it just reminds me when I'm in graduate school of getting into a discussion with a professor who saw the 14 points as being superseding, as being the principal, if you will, legacy of Woodrow Wilson. I felt that it was contradicted by small inconveniences like lynchings. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that what the professor at the time called a bump in the road of history, the treatment of many of its citizens in juxtaposition to this grand vision of this president who in fact was extraordinary in enunciating and mapping out a grand narrative, the 14 points. How were you able to basically put this together into a narrative that basically brought this to the fore?
An excellent question, and it was a profound challenge of this process of putting this film together. We spent a long time developing this story and really examining all of the different angles, and the Wilson narrative is so complicated, and when you get to the end of what we just watched, and I'm always really moved by Chris Capozzola when he says, sorry about this, the idealism of what Wilson is professing in the 14 points is very appealing, and it's very tempting to sort of latch onto that and grasp at this American exceptionalism. But when you really look at all of the threads that were going in the undercurrent of the country at the time, to me, that was the story that really needed to be told. And I felt like, we all felt, working on this project, that the story of the Harlem Hellfighters and African-American experience at that time was critical, and Alice Paul as well. There was some debate as to whether the story of suffrage belonged in a film about World War I, but her comments about her challenge to Woodrow Wilson on the issue of making the world safe for democracy felt like the whole story to us in many ways.
Yeah, and I guess, Chad, that this American exceptionalism, that was, it was so transcendent in the view of many that it made everything else a footnote. And perhaps that's why history has been told the way it has been, where everything else seemed to be, that is to say, the contradictions did not seem to basically even parallel this broader story, this greater story, because exceptionalism was again axiomatic.
Yeah, I think Woodrow Wilson is incredibly complicated. On the one hand, he's one of the great progressives in American history. He accomplished incredible feats domestically and internationally, but at the same time, he's a white supremacist. And I think it's important to recognize that those two are not mutually exclusive. And one of the important things, I think, about centering the experiences of African Americans, for example, is that African Americans at this time recognized those contradictions, recognized that Woodrow Wilson had incredible potential, that his call for democracy had incredible potential, that it really tapped into some of the deepest ideals of African Americans. But at the same time, they recognized that he was deeply flawed, that he was not responding to the needs of African Americans as it related to their basic safety and humanity in the country. So those tensions were there, and throughout the course of the war, African Americans really laid them bare and made sure that they were addressed in fundamental ways.
The notion of going back to World War I is absolutely important in itself. It's a history, again, we don't always see or understand or look at the scope of beyond starting, of course, with its provenance. And we talk about that quite often, how this began with the Archduke and so on and so forth. But to see these other dimensions are just absolutely extraordinary. But it does raise the question, Chris, what parallels, and we have to get into parallels, of course, do you basically see today to the social issues that were generated during that period?
Well, I think that's a good question, but I think parallels is the wrong word, because I think these are not questions that from 1917 that we are dealing with again today. They're questions that have endured throughout the 20th century or even since the founding. Fundamental questions about what is the size and the role of the federal government, what are our relations with one another, what is America's place in the world. I mean, those are questions we come back to constantly in our public life. What happens in a moment of political and sort of and military crisis, what happens in the war, is that it makes the fault lines visible that have always been there in American life. And so in that sense, today, when we're living in a time of really contentious politics, I think we're just seeing fault lines that have been there since the founding.
I'm going to turn to some of the questions that have come from you, our audience, and ask you a few of my own. But one question that I think is really worth exploring is, what books would you recommend reading about the starting of World War I, the war itself, the aftermath of the war? Who'd like to go for that?
Shameless self-promotion?
Shameless self-promotion, that's right. Shameless is fine.
Well, I would start with Chris's book. See how gracious I was with that? But in all honesty, I mean, to understand some of these tensions that we're alluding to, the types of coercive measures that 100% Americanism necessitated, I think Chris's book is an excellent start. I mean, there's really an incredible body
what's the name of Chris?
of scholarship.
What's the name of your book?
Mine
What's the
is
name of the book?
Uncle Sam Wants You.
Okay, all right. Chad?
Just it's easy to remember title. And Chad's book, Torchbearers of Democracy, also on the list.
But I think this is really one of the great things about this series is all the historians that were pulled into it. Throughout the entire consultation process, it's really a stellar cast of who's who of some of the top historians who have written about World War I broadly, but American participation in the war specifically.
Yeah, one of our challenges was that there wasn't one single book that you could go to for this subject that really told you the story, and so it was a challenge. I mean, we did a tremendous amount of research and talked to so many people who really helped with telling the story, because there are so many nuances and so many different angles that we wanted to make sure to cover.
You know, when I was growing up, my stepfather used to say, "I'll give you a quarter if you learn something new today." And I'm just going to ask the audience, did you learn something new today? There we go. And another question from the audience is World War I the watershed for the 20th and the 21st century, or is it forgotten? And I guess there are a lot of ways of answering that, aren't there? Amanda, you did this for a reason.
Yes, I think that for many people, World War I, it has been a forgotten war. It is not something that is high on people's list in terms of American history, and to spend 6 hours on it, I think, was a brave move on the part of the American experience and public television. And to me, what really drew me to this subject, I think that people think of the Archduke Ferdinand, and they think of this as a distant war that's in black and white and feels kind of scratchy and far away. And to me, this was really a war about the shaping of America. You think of it, I think that part of the reason it's receded is because the military history has taken over. But really, as the clip today demonstrated, we didn't even see any battle in this. So much of this story is really about America coming of age in some ways and really changing and having some serious growing pains while it does. But to me, it feels like a very relevant story.
For historians, it must be really, historians of World War I, it must be getting this story out. You must have been thrilled when Amanda got in touch.
No, I think, like Chad said, we're impressed by the commitment to history from American experience, right? And to really unearthing new materials. I think we all saw things that have never been seen before on the screen tonight. But also, I think, to get a dialogue going about the war. And so the answer to your question, is this the watershed of the 20th century or forgotten, is yes, it's both. Mm-hmm. And our challenge at this centennial moment is to figure out, what is it from a century ago that we are still living with? What was that watershed?
Please, go on, Chad.
And back to your question about books, I mean, I became interested in the experiences of African Americans in World War I through a book that was published, I believe, in 1974, entitled The Unknown Soldiers, which was about African American service in the war. And just the title itself really spoke to this idea that the history and memory of African American participation in the war had been indeed forgotten or was unknown or lost in some way. But I think it's also important to recognize the ways in which that history hasn't been lost, the ways in which that there are family narratives and folklore and different ways that the war has remained very vivid in the American popular imagination, but also in more local and intimate ways as well. So I think the centennial really offers an opportunity to explore the war from multiple perspectives.
Well, the whole point of American Experience, our flagship program on PBS, is to, in fact, to explore these type of topics. But when you explore history quite often, by the time you get to something as long ago, over 100 years ago, as World War I, you start to romanticize what that war was about. As many romanticize the feats of Woodrow Wilson and those of his predecessors, like Teddy Roosevelt. You think about the Rough Riders and so on and so forth. And when you're trying to tell a hard story, those bits about Alice Paul, for example, and these suffragists, that must feel really sometimes difficult, Amanda, to tell, because you're not sure how people are going to perceive that particular contradiction in their American history.
Yeah, but for me, that's the fun part. I mean, to really get into the stories and the characters and the people who were living at that time period and look at their own words and their own experiences as a way to bring history to life today. Because I think that that's her story in particular. Is not something that people know, and then when you see it, it's such a dramatic moment.
I didn't know it.
You didn't know it,
I didn't know
right?
it, no.
And using her words to actually bring this to life, I think it's the way to make the history feel relevant today.
We have some other questions, and one of the reasons I'm hesitating a little bit here, because some of the handwriting is great, some of it not so great. This is good handwriting right here. Okay. Was finding archival stills and moving images of World War II difficult? That is there a oh boy, is there a what's that word right here? Federal database. Ah, excellent. All right. Great question.
Yes.
All right.
So the archival research on this project was a vast enterprise, and it was really, we dug extremely deep. We've been working on this. We began work on this in 2014, which might feel like 1914.
Oh, yeah.
No, but I did realize today that we basically spent as much time putting this film together as it took for America to join the war effort. So. But we actually researched, it was 140 archives in 11 countries around the world. So there was a tremendous amount of digging to be done. The Signal Corps collection at the National Archives here in America was an incredible resource, and there was great material there, and a lot of that is available online. You can find it through databasing, but we also transferred a lot of original film reels that had never been seen before, and did a lot of work preserving that and cleaning it up so that it would be as vivid as possible for viewers.
Right. Does the film gauge Wilson's leadership as commander-in-chief of his troops? Chris, Chad?
I think it is. I think there's more of that in episode 3, and maybe Amanda can talk to the specifics of it. But I think that the film overall does convey, in the broader sense, of how the challenge that Wilson and the federal government had to mobilize this army, to equip it, and to move it to France. So watching a kind of slice of the middle, we see a little bit less of that. And then also the way that the army as an institution is transformed overnight from a small force focused largely on conquest and occupation of the West and the Philippines and Puerto Rico, into this sort of not just asserting global power as an idea, but actually sort of carrying it out institutionally.
I think one of the things that you get a sense of in this clip is how Wilson was particularly invested in the big ideas of the war, democracy, self-determination. As commander-in-chief, in some respects, he left a lot to be desired. He was not particularly interested in the minutia of what was taking place on the battlefield. He left that to Pershing and his other generals, perhaps to the detriment of the American Expeditionary Forces. Wilson was fixated on the peace, really, and making sure that through America's success on the battlefield, he would be positioned to have kind of the preeminent seat at the peace table.
Did he envisage, when you look at these various steps during the war, the lead up to the war and into the war itself, did he actually envisage the United States basically coming from this level as a nation to this level as a nation? In other words, was this, do you look at what he did strategically, or were there accidental steps that basically propelled the United States to the position of prominence, if you will, in terms of the use of propaganda, for example, that transformed the nation into a supporter of World War I, and then to the U.S.'s final incarnation at the end of the war into a greater power?
One of my favorite quotes that's in there from Wilson at one moment in this episode is he says, "It is not an army we are creating for war, we are shaping for this war, it is a nation." And I think in many ways the war was an opportunity for Wilson to shape America, and what you see so much, both for good and for bad, in the way that that the population comes together in support of the war. There's an incredible effort to make that happen. It doesn't happen naturally, and I think that that's a big part of what Wilson is trying to do. Is really shape the nation and transform America into a global power, but also into kind of a united force nationally.
Nationally, right. Another question from our audience is, how many African-American troops were killed in action during World War I?
That's a very specific question. Let's see if I can remember the exact numbers. I believe the numbers are certainly in the low thousands, I would say. You certainly have a number of African Americans serving in the Harlem Hellfighters, the 15th National Guard, in the 93rd Division, which the 15th National Guard was a part of, seeing extended service on the front lines. You also have another black combat division, the 92nd Division, which was composed of draftees, men, African-American men from the Selective Service Act. So you have casualties in those combat divisions. I wish I could have the precise number of casualties, but you also have a number of African-Americans similar to other troops in the American Expeditionary Forces who are also dying from various causes, disease being the most significant.
What were the diseases primarily?
Influenza, the flu, took a heavy toll on American troops, and I believe there are actually more casualties in the American Expeditionary Forces through the flu than there were actually on the battlefield.
Notwithstanding that, Chris, your answer earlier, in fact, there are several questions here regarding parallels. I know historically you tinker with that term, but I think this question here is, and I think they're looking for specifics here, are there any parallels between the nationalism and political chaos in the period leading up to World War I and the rising nationalism and political chaos of today, of the moment?
Oh, man.
Get all the good questions.
Right. Sure. Yeah. Of course there are. Yes. And I think in every sense, in the sense that the rates of immigration to the United States are at rates in the 1910s that are still not matched to in the U.S. population today. The questions about how those migrations would be regulated, or of course date back to the 1910s. The U.S. Border Patrol is a creation of the war era, first to handle the smuggling of arms during the Mexican Revolution and then institutionalized in 1924. Debates about who makes a good immigrant are an issue at the turn of the century. During World War I, over Woodrow Wilson's veto, the United States adopts a literacy test that makes it, requires people who want to migrate into the United States to be literate in some language. And then follows this up with increasingly restrictive regulations in 1921, 24, and 27 that shape the character, the sort of fundamental character of the American population for decades to come. So, of course, that's an issue. But it's also a moment when Americans are debating, how it is that we can welcome immigrants to our country. Jane Addams, who you saw here tonight, in a place like in Hull House in Chicago, is trying to celebrate what she calls immigrant gifts. The writer Randolph Bourne is trying to imagine what he calls transnational America. There are sort of ongoing debates that I think there are lessons on, for everyone, and that's just one slice of our political chaos today. I could go on.
I mean, I think one of the things that struck people, of course, is I'm sure everyone immediately thought, well, Germans, World War I, Japanese, World War II, and Germans, and Muslims, perhaps, in 2017. Is that one of the parallels you're hearing or seeing? I assume people that's something they've talked with you about in terms of the way people are sectionalized in society?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a question, and it's also, in many ways, it's an important question of national security, right? And that there are instances in the United States of violence that make people afraid. But then that fear is operationalized as a political tool that ends up dividing Americans and that targets, in many ways, the more politically vulnerable. So it is a fundamental debate, like I said, an enduring question about security and liberty. But I think it raises very important.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap up and probably have time for a brief response to another question. I wonder if you could elaborate, one of you, on the impact of influenza across Europe as it impacted American troops during that period. That's another question from the audience here.
Well, I alluded to it a little bit. I mean, the influenza pandemic was devastating, and specifically for the American Army. I believe in the third episode we'll really get into the battlefield and specifically the big operation by the American Expeditionary Forces in the fall of 1918, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. This was seen as the moment when the United States was going to prove itself and kind of seal the deal. And the American Army bogged down in large part because so many soldiers were sick. They had the flu, and it really hampered the military effectiveness of the American Army. But even within training camps in the United States, in the Boston area, the flu took a devastating toll. So it was, really one of the most significant factors in how the war played out.
And as you point out, one of the segments that's shown in the 6-hour documentary, which I'm hoping everyone will see. I want to thank you very much for being a part of our audience, and I want to thank our panelists, Chris, Chad, Amanda. Thank you very much. And again, thank you for coming out on a wet night. And the American Experience 6-hour begins on April 10th. And again on April 11th, and you can watch it in its entirety. 6 hours, grab some popcorn, and enjoy yourself. I'd like to thank the Kennedy Library. Thank you very much.
Old Colonel Jones looks like a powder pigeon as they go swinging by. Old Colonel Jones looks like a powder pigeon as they go marching by his door. Each high from title says farewell, my daddy.